Hey, sorry about not making a proper video in a while. I've been spending my time studying. Yeah. Well, it's about time I get a new review out that isn't something that I despise or feel completely indifferent to. So let's cover Shin Sekai Yori. Everybody seems to be interested in what my opinion is of it. Whoa! Shin Sekai Yori, or From the New World, is a science fiction fantasy-esque dystopian utopian anime series set 1,000 years into the future. It revolves around 5 young students training to use their psychic powers and dealing with the harsh consequences of their society and history. If there's one thing I love, it's literature. I read a lot of books of all sorts, but mostly just classical or well-received novels. I keep hearing comparisons with Shin Sekai Yori to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, but I'm not so sure about that. While I think there are some similarities, I honestly think it's more comparable to H.G. Wells' Time Machine or Lewis Lowry's The Giver. Being pseudo-intellectual aside, Shin Sekai Yori's plot is probably one of the strongest anime as a medium has to offer. Which is funny because it's based on a novel, that's right, a novel. Not a light novel, not a manga, a legit book with text. And editors. And no Jesus coons. Somehow, A1 Pictures, the studio behind its production, managed to translate the written format perfectly to a visual medium. It shows as much as it tells, and the pacing is utterly impeccable, despite the characters dragging certain scenes down, which we'll get to later. But really, other than that, something's always going on. Even when it makes use of time skips, they're used tastefully. The star of the series is truly the lore and the setting. Shin Sekai Yori has an astoundingly fleshed out world. It's an alien rendition of ancient Japan, and has very consistent rules, whatnot with the society and the psychokinetic powers known as the Cantus. Sadly, some of the information to get to know this world is delivered through info dumping, albeit there isn't a lot, but I especially don't like me info dumping. I usually consider it to be kind of lazy writing. But in this case, it kind of works. Some rules can be broken, and there isn't too much, but be prepared for episode 4 because half of the episode is like textbook info dumping. It is really interesting though. Just, I mean, look at it like a horse pill that you have to swallow before getting better, but the pill so happens to taste like cake. So, more importantly, this along with a handful of other series managed to make me cry at the end. Because for all things Shin Sekai Yori does well, it does one thing above all else. Subtlety. Something very few shows seem to have these days. You haven't come out yet and you're already showing the vaginal outlines. Shin Sekai Yori manages to take concepts of the world building, character traits, and plot and ties them perfectly into the themes. The foreshadowing in the first episode is unparalleled, except for the likes of Misaki Yuasa and Kon, and other masters of the craft. The ending was also fantastic and really made the entire experience worthwhile. At first, I saw it as kind of predictable and kind of cheesy, but then it added elements from the rest of the show at the last second to say something else entirely, which took me by surprise. That's the funny thing about the series. Anything that you could consider cliche or out of place makes sense after further examination and says something you might not have expected it to say. You'll never find black and white concepts here, and that's something I utterly adore. Everything seems to be painted in a beautiful shade of gray, and gray never looks more beautiful than with storytelling. I feel Shin Sekai was incredibly profound and nearly perfect in the story department at least. Any problems with the story are really with the characters, but all in all, it's utterly exceptional. What's the best way to describe the characters of Shin Sekai Yori? Well, they're like wet grilled cheese. They'd taste good if they weren't watered down. In all seriousness, the characters are aight. Nothing too great, but nothing too offensive either. Out of the 5 main characters, Saki, Satoru, Shun, Maria, and Mamoru, only Saki and Satoru really get some real screen time to bounce off of each other. This is a shame, since all the characters aside from Mamoru, who is an annoying little dipshit, are fairly likable and play important parts in the story. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I'll say Saki's probably the only truly complex character out of the group, despite coming across as rather bland at first glance. Since Arc 1 was primarily focused on Satoru and Saki, the second arc, which focused more on the others, that is to say Shun, Maria, and Mamoru, felt really empty because of the lack of development and dimension. I felt they dropped the ball on this one because I could only imagine how impactful the middle of the show would be if they were given more screen time to make us care. Maybe if they had switched around between Saki's group and Shun's group during the war between the queer rats in the first arc, this could have been avoided. That being said, I found a lot of the side characters to be interesting despite being rushed off somewhere after a little while or pretty much instantly. I especially loved the main antagonist, who is focused on in the last third of the series. Now that character is multidimensional and interesting. The voice acting in Japanese is as solid as always. In the first arc, it's very noticeable the male characters were played by female seiyus. Keep in mind, it's still well played. There are two standouts in the show. Yuki Kaji as Satoru not only delivers everything with an unprecedented degree of passion, but also manages to portray the character in, a fun kind of way. And also props for Daisuke Namikawa for playing Squealer. That guy's played Yukio and Beck. The dude's got range. Now, the dub on the other hand, well, you got Greg Ayres, who acts aight, but his voice sounds like a 10-year-old who's been let loose on a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah, but everyone knows your impulsive force exchange totally sucks.
Give me a break! The teacher said it's more important to practice visualization, didn't he?
Him playing Satoru is incredibly grating, and I wasn't too impressed by anybody else either, though none of the rest of the cast was too bad. But couldn't they have gotten younger sounding actors to play the kid versions? Or just push the range a little bit more? The script for the dub isn't horrible, but it does touch upon the whole gotta sound like the cool kids thing Mirai Nikki did. I also didn't like the fact that they translated the word Aki, which means an evil spirit or devil, to ogre. I find that to be kind of moronic. Whenever they say it just makes me think of Shrek.
Suddenly, he saw an ogre running toward him.
What are you doing in my swamp?
I don't think that's the effect they should be going for. I definitely prefer the fan-translated Fiend, which sounds more intimidating. Something weird to mention, in episode 5 and 10, this is probably due to directional differences, but there was a noticeable lack of sound effects in specific places. It wasn't game-changing or anything, just noticeable, and as for the soundtrack, it's used alright. I'm not really too keen on how repetitive it is. Half of the OST eventually gets shot down because some of the tracks only fit the lighthearted first few episodes. Not too many tracks stand out either. That being said, Dvorak's From the New World Symphony second movement is one of the most effective uses of classical music in anime since Joy of Man's Desiring and End of Evangelion, and always gives me shivers every time it's used. On another quick note, Wareta Ringo might be one of my all-time favorite ending themes. It's right up there with Taisho from Higurashi, Shiki no Uta from Shampoo, and Suki no Uta from Technolize. I fucking love the way it sounds. Pair that along with the beautifully directed visuals, and you got yourself a right old masterpiece of an ED. Every show has to have a weakest link, and the weakest aspect of Shin Sekai Yori, hands down, is the animation. Don't get me wrong, the direction is fairly good and the character designs are decent. There are even a few moments that absolutely blew me away, but the actual animation itself from a technical standpoint is really lackluster. The show tries to hide the low frame rate and bland backgrounds as much as possible with lighting and tricks. Characters consist of 6 to 8 colors, a rather unimpressive number. Compare that to, say, Technolize, which has 9 to 12 per character, and that was made in 2003. Shin Sekai Yori's lack of highlights and lowlights makes everything look extremely flat. Of course, and then there's the guest director, who was brought on to completely fuck up everything that he touched. Well, at least with episode 5. The character designs were just completely changed for some reason, and everything is zoomed in on like crazy to the point where you can't tell what the fuck is going on. And then the weird lighting effects, and then the fucking strange textures and the scenery, and oh my god, is it a mess. The same guy came back for episode 10, and while that episode did have the same problems to a much lesser degree, it at least looked interesting and was fairly well executed for the most part. Overall, it just doesn't look amazing. It's certainly not the animation a show like this deserves, but I can understand why they didn't have much to work with, because a certain shitty show about an online MMO was made by the same studio in a very similar time frame. I'm sure A1 Pictures knew it wasn't going to be that successful in comparison to that show, and so poured their budget into the twilight for shonen fans. It's not really fair, but that's the nature of these things. Of course, there was some effort to fix some of the animation hiccups from the original TV version to the Blu Ray release, but I was only able to find one solid comparison. And there it is! A smile. I'm sure there are more, but I wasn't able to find too many. Shin Sekai Yori is a very special and unique anime. Would I recommend it to everyone? No way. Most people are probably going to get bored. This is a show for only people who can appreciate a well-crafted story, and it's probably one of the absolute best around. It's no character piece, and it's not for those seeking well-done action set pieces either. And it's not for those looking for a deeply immersive soundtrack, but nonetheless, it's remarkable. I wish I could give it higher, but I'm only going to give this one a 7 out of 10. I'm serious when I say that this could be a new favorite of mine, so take that as you will. If you're interested in the slightest, I implore you to go watch it right now. If you liked Shin Sekai Yori, I'd probably recommend Nagi no Asakura. It's got a very similar sort of atmosphere, but it's different enough and focuses on the characters more. I would also probably recommend number 6. It's a utopian sort of dystopia, and while it's not nearly half as good, it's got gay people? strange one to say the least. It's a mix of a lot of stuff I've seen before, and sometimes that's not such a bad thing. But in the case of Diary, it's borrowing from a lot of bona fide epic stuff.